We all know Friday the 13th Part 3 as the movie that gave Jason his iconic hockey mask. But behind that mask lies a production filled with disturbing stories, bizarre decisions, and secrets that would haunt the cast and crew for decades. From an alternate ending too dark to release to the real-life horror that inspired one of the film's most traumatic scenes, these are 20 facts about Friday the 13th Part 3 that will change how you watch this movie forever. Let's dive in. Fact 1. The hockey mask was a last-minute accident. The most iconic image in horror history, it happened by pure chance. During a lighting check on set, 3D effects supervisor Martin Sadoff, who was a massive hockey fan, grabbed a Detroit Red Wings goaltender mask and handed it to director Steve Miner just to have something to work with. Miner immediately loved it, but there was a problem. The mask was too small for actor Richard Brooker's face, so makeup effects director Doug White used a technique called vacuform to literally stretch and enlarge the mask, creating a completely new mold. Art director Terry Ballard then added the now famous red triangles to make it look more menacing. They punched holes in it, altered the markings, and completely transformed it from the original hockey gear. The mask that would define slasher films for generations was cobbled together from spare parts and creative problem solving. Without that random lighting check, Jason might have looked completely different today. Fact 2. The film had a secret title to avoid union trouble. During production, Friday the 13th Part 3 wasn't actually called Friday the 13th Part 3. The fake working title was Crystal Japan, named after a David Bowie instrumental track. Why all the secrecy? Paramount Pictures was making an absolute fortune on these Friday the 13th films, but they were employing non-union labor at every level of production. Film industry labor unions were furious about it, and the studio knew that if word got out about another Friday the 13th shoot, there would be major problems. So they used code names. This actually started a weird tradition in the franchise. Several later Friday the 13th films would also use David Bowie song titles as fake production names to throw people off the trail. It's darkly ironic that one of the biggest horror franchises of all time had to hide in the shadows just to get made. Fact 3. The movie was released on Friday the 13th. This one sounds obvious, but it's actually pretty rare. The film hit theaters on Friday, August 13th, 1982, making it the very first film in the franchise to actually premiere on a Friday the 13th. You'd think they would have done this from the start, right? But the planets just hadn't aligned until Part 3. The studio recognized what a marketing goldmine this was, and the timing couldn't have been better. Following Part 3's success with this strategy, the franchise did it 4 more times. That August 1982 release date helped Part 3 break the opening weekend record for horror films at the time, raking in over $9.4 million in just 3 days. Friday the 13th finally happened on Friday the 13th, and the box office proved it was worth the wait. Fact 4. Chris's backstory remains disturbingly ambiguous. One of the most disturbing elements of Part 3 is something the film intentionally leaves unclear. The main character, Chris, has a traumatic history with Jason. 2 years before the events of the film, Chris ran away from her family's property after an argument and ended up in the woods. There, she encountered Jason and passed out. When she woke up, she was in her own bed with no memory of how she got there. What happened during those missing hours is deliberately left ambiguous by the filmmakers. Early script discussions reportedly involved a much darker backstory, but the creative team decided this would be too exploitative and chose to keep Chris's past with Jason mysterious. Actress Dana Kimmel herself has rejected darker interpretations of the scene. What we're left with is an unsettling question mark. Something happened, but we'll never know exactly what. This ambiguity makes Chris's terror when facing Jason again even more visceral and adds a layer of psychological horror that's rare in slasher films. Fact 5. Performances literally didn't matter, only the 3D effects. Here's something that'll blow your mind. The actors were basically told their performances didn't matter. This was the first film to use the Mark's 3D system, and it was so technically complicated that everything else became secondary. Actress Tracy Savage, who played Debbie, was brutally honest about it. The key priority in every scene was making sure that the 3D effects worked. It didn't matter how the lines were delivered. It didn't matter if we stumbled or fumbled. We never did a second take. The 3D effects were a very technical, difficult thing to do. Actor Larry Zerner, who played Shelley, recalled being told over and over, hit the camera, asshole," when throwing a wallet for a 3D gag. David Cadams, who played Chuck, was even more blunt. The writing and the acting didn't matter at all. I don't imagine any of us really feel like this was the crowning glory of our talent. The entire cast basically admits this was a technical experiment first, movie second. That's why the performances can feel so wooden, because nobody cared if they weren't. Fact 6. It took hours to set up single shots. Because of the experimental 3D technology, what would normally be a quick setup could take an entire day. The crew sometimes spent hours just preparing one shot, making sure the depth perception worked correctly and the 3D effects would pop on screen. Everything had to be lit far brighter than a normal film. Colors had to be carefully chosen. Certain shades didn't work in 3D. The cameras were massive and difficult to maneuver, and if something went wrong, they'd have to start from scratch. This meant the shooting schedule was grueling. The cast spent hours waiting around, and entire scenes had to be completely reshot when the 3D didn't work as planned. Fact 7. Early scenes were completely reshot. Speaking of technical problems, some of the earliest footage they shot was so bad they had to throw it out and start over. The opening tracking shot and the convenience store scene with Shelley and the bikers were originally filmed but deemed unusable because the 3D simply didn't work. The technology was so new that the crew was essentially learning on the job. By the time they'd figured out how to properly use the cameras and lenses, they'd already wasted time and money shooting scenes that never made it into the film. It's a testament to how experimental and risky this production was. They were literally inventing techniques as they went, with no guarantee any of it would actually work. Fact 8. The film knocked E.T. out of the #1 spot. Here's a wild piece of box office history. Friday the 13th Part 3 was the first film to knock E.T. the Extraterrestrial out of the #1 spot. That's right, Steven Spielberg's beloved alien movie that had dominated the box office for weeks was finally dethroned by Jason Voorhees in a hockey mask. Part 3 grossed $36.7 million domestically on a tiny $2.2 million budget, making it a massive financial success. It became the second highest grossing horror film of 1982, only behind Poltergeist, and to this day remains the fourth highest grossing film in the entire Friday the 13th franchise. Fact 9. The movie was supposed to end the franchise. Believe it or not, Part 3 was intended to be the final film in the trilogy. Paramount wanted to wrap up the story and move on. That's why the ending feels somewhat conclusive. Chris defeats Jason and escapes. But here's the twist. The film didn't have any kind of final chapter subtitle or indication that it was meant to be the last one. The studio was being careful. They wanted the option to continue if it made enough money, which, of course, it did. So much for endings. The success of Part 3 guaranteed that Jason would return, again and again and again. What was supposed to be a trilogy closer became just another chapter in a franchise that still continues today. Fact 10. Steve Miner is the only director to make 2 Friday the 13th films. Director Steve Miner came back from Part 2 to helm Part 3, making him the only person in the franchise's history to direct more than one Friday the 13th film. That's actually remarkable when you consider how many sequels there are. Miner was trusted because Part 2 had been successful and he understood the formula, but after Part 3, he never returned to the series. Instead, he went on to have a solid career in Hollywood, directing films like Forever Young with Mel Gibson and, interestingly, Halloween H20, 20 years later in 1998. This makes Miner the only director to helm entries in 2 of the big 3 slasher franchises, Friday the 13th and Halloween. His work on Part 3 cemented the franchise's visual style and proved that Jason could carry a film even with the gimmick of 3D. Fact 11. They recreated the Kevin Bacon death scene. One of the most memorable kills in Part 3, Debbie's death by knife through the hammock, is actually a direct recreation of Kevin Bacon's death in the original Friday the 13th. In that film, Bacon's character is stabbed through the throat from below while lying in bed. In Part 3, they flipped the gender, swapped the bed for a hammock, and used the exact same special effect rig that Tom Savini created for the first film. What makes this even more meta is what Debbie is reading right before she dies, Fangoria magazine. And if you look closely, it's an issue with Tom Savini on the cover. The movie is literally paying homage to its own franchise history while recreating one of its most iconic deaths. It's a love letter to the original film disguised as a murder scene. Fact 12. Richard Brooker's prosthetic face took 6 hours to apply. Playing Jason wasn't just about putting on a mask. Actor Richard Brooker had to sit through 6-hour makeup sessions to apply the prosthetic face he wore under the hockey mask. The makeup department created 2 different versions, one incredibly detailed prosthetic made from 11 separate appliances for scenes where the mask came off, and a simpler one-piece mask for scenes where the hockey mask stayed on. The complex prosthetic was inspired by Tom Savini's original Jason design from the end of the first film. Brooker had to endure this process multiple times throughout the shoot, essentially transforming into a monster before he could even start acting. Fact 13. This is the only film where Jason screams in pain. If you watch Part 3 closely, you'll notice something that never happens again in the franchise. Jason audibly reacts to pain. When Chris stabs him, he screams. When he's hit, he visibly flinches. This is one of the only Friday the 13th films where Jason seems even remotely human, where he's not yet the unstoppable supernatural force he becomes in later sequels. In Part 2, Jason also showed some pain responses, but by Part 4 and beyond, he's essentially a Terminator who shrugs off everything. Part 3 exists in this weird transitional space where Jason is still somewhat mortal, still somewhat vulnerable. It makes the kills more grounded, but also less mythic. Watching him scream when stabbed is jarring if you're used to the silent, indestructible Jason of the later films. Fact 14, the final chase is one of the longest in the franchise. The last 30 minutes are essentially one extended chase sequence, and it's widely considered one of the best in the entire franchise. Chris is pursued by Jason all over the property, through the barn, into the house, back outside. It's relentless, brutal, and surprisingly well choreographed. What makes it work is that Jason in Part 3 actually runs. Richard Brooker's Jason is fast and aggressive in a way that later Jasons aren't. Most iterations of Jason do the slow, methodical walk, but Brooker sprints after his victims, making him genuinely terrifying. Fact 15. The film's location burned down. Friday the 13th Part 3 was shot at the Valuset Movie Ranch in Saugus, California, and it was the first film in the series not to be shot on the East Coast. The house, barn, and lake were all custom-built specifically for the movie. For years after the film's release, these structures remained standing on the ranch, becoming a bit of a pilgrimage site for fans. But in 2006, tragedy struck. The house burned down. Just like that, a piece of horror history was gone. The barn and some other structures may have remained for a time, but the iconic house where so much of the carnage took place was reduced to ashes. It's a strange, almost poetic end for a location that was the site of so much fictional death. Fact 16. There was a much darker alternate ending that was actually filmed. The ending you see in the theatrical version of Part 3, Chris having a nightmare where Mrs. Voorhees' corpse drags her into the lake, then waking up in police custody, wasn't the original plan. The filmmakers actually shot a completely different alternate ending that was deemed too dark to release. In this filmed but never released version, Chris wakes up in the canoe and hears what sounds like her boyfriend Rick calling to her from the house. She runs to the porch, excited to see him alive. But when she reaches the door, Jason, now unmasked and wielding a machete, bursts through and decapitates her. This was also meant to be a dream sequence, leading into Chris waking up screaming in the back of a police car, but the decapitation itself was considered too brutal and depressing. Production stills from this lost ending have since surfaced online, confirming it was fully shot with special effects by Stan Winston. Paramount decided audiences wouldn't accept the final girl dying, even in a nightmare, so they reshot the ending with the Mrs. Voorhees Lake jump scare instead. Fact 17, Jason's name is never said in the entire film. Here's something you probably never noticed. Nobody in Friday the 13th Part 3 actually says Jason's name. Not once. This has been confirmed by multiple sources and is even noted in the Friday the 13th wiki. The only time you hear it is during the recap of Part 2's ending at the beginning of the film, which is just reused footage from the previous movie. Throughout the entire film, none of the new characters ever identify Jason by name. They don't know who he is. He's just a masked killer stalking them. It's a strange quirk that makes the film feel more isolated and mysterious. like the characters are fighting something unknown rather than a legendary monster. This creates an interesting disconnect. Audiences know exactly who Jason Voorhees is, but the victims on screen have no idea they're being hunted by Crystal Lake's most infamous resident. Fact 18. Shelley's death is the cruelest example of boy who cried wolf. Poor Shelley. The character spends the entire movie pulling pranks and fake scaring people with rubber masks and fake weapons. He's annoying, sure, but ultimately harmless. So when Jason actually slits his throat and Shelley stumbles inside looking for help,
nice makeup job.
What happens? Nobody believes him. Chili, the girl he's been trying to impress, thinks it's just another one of his stupid pranks. She literally ignores him as he's bleeding out. By the time anyone realizes it's real, Shelley is dead. It's a brutal example of boy who cried wolf, and it's genuinely tragic in how preventable it is. Fact 19. The screenwriter was brought in to add menace. The original script for Part 3 was deemed not scary enough, so Paramount brought in screenwriter Petru Popescu to do an uncredited rewrite specifically to add menace to the story. Popescu was less than thrilled with the assignment and later spoke pretty dismissively about the whole project. But his job was clear: make it darker, make it scarier, make Jason more threatening. Whether he succeeded is debatable, but it's interesting that even the studio recognized the script was too light and needed a horror injection. This kind of last-minute rewrite is common in franchise filmmaking, where the formula is more important than the story. Fact 20. The film pioneered the 1980s 3D horror boom. Friday the 13th Part 3 didn't just use 3D as a gimmick, it kicked off an entire wave of 3D horror films in the 1980s. Before Part 3, 3D had mostly died out after the 1950s craze. But the success of this film proved there was still a market for it, especially in horror. Suddenly, studios were rushing to make their own 3D horror movies. Jaws 3D, Amityville 3D, Parasite 3D, and several others all came out in the early to mid-80s, trying to capitalize on the trend. None of them were as successful as Part 3, but the point was made. Audiences would pay extra to see blood and guts flying at them in 3 dimensions. Part 3 essentially revived a dead format, even if only temporarily. That's a legacy that goes beyond just the Friday the 13th franchise. So, there you have it. 20 disturbing, weird, and fascinating facts about Friday the 13th Part 3. From accidental hockey masks to alternate endings too dark for theaters, this movie is stranger and more troubled behind the scenes than most people realize. The film that gave Jason his iconic look was a chaotic, experimental production where nobody cared about the acting, the locations burned down, and the ending had to be reshot because it was too depressing. It's a miracle the movie works at all, but it does, and it remains a cult classic. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe for more horror deep dives. And let me know in the comments, would you have preferred the darker alternate ending? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.